Welcome back to Live from Paris here on France 24. I'm Mark Owen. These are the main world news headlines. France is to ban single-use plastics by 2020. Prime Minister Edouard Philippe announcing the measure, part of a series of eye-catching policies billed as the second phase of President Macron's reforms. The ringleaders of the Catalan independence movement are awaiting the verdict in their treason trial. They face up to 25 years if found guilty over the illegal declaration of independence in 2017. Protesters against the extradition law in Hong Kong came under a hail of rubber bullets fired at them by police. Over 70 were taken to hospital. They fear the law change will erode human rights and increase Beijing's influence. The EU says Hong Kong's rights need to be respected. Thank you very much for being with us. France is to ban single-use plastics by 2020. This bold move was announced by Prime Minister Edouard Philippe this Tuesday. He addressed lawmakers on commitments to put the environment and social justice at the heart of policymaking between now and the end of President Macron's mandate in 2022.
Over the next 12 months, we will accelerate our environmental measures. The first part of our plan is to make the economy cleaner. We want to give citizens the means to heat themselves without polluting more or paying more. Thus, we will transform the energy transition tax credit into a larger aid, given to those who need it the most. The second part of our plan will be to end with waste, to end with a model of consumption where the mines are ever deeper and the mountains of trash ever larger.
Edouard Philippe, French Prime Minister, speaking a little earlier in the National Assembly. Let's bring in climate expert François Gemène. He's a professor at Sciences Po, Executive Director of Earth Politics and President of the think tank Ecosphere. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. How effective could this be, France banning single-use plastics by next year?
Well, obviously, this is an important measure, and I think that Prime Minister Edouard Philippe obviously had to make some kind of announcement following the results of the European elections, where the Greens polled at 13.5%, making them the third largest political force in the country. Obviously, it was an easy move to announce a ban on single plastic use, and I think it was also a way for them to avoid the fact of being criticized for not doing enough on climate change. For example, I was surprised by the lack of announcements regarding greenhouse gas emissions in France. So surely the ban on single plastic use is important. I think it's doable, but that's barely not enough.
And in terms of President Macron's green credentials, I'm thinking back to Nicolas Hulot, France's most prominent green campaigner, very famously wasn't impressed by him, resigning last August, stating, "I no longer want to lie to myself." Do you feel any more convinced by President Macron's green credentials?
Not really, and I have to say that Edouard Philippe himself acknowledged that it took him a very long time to recognize that ecological measures were now a matter of priority alongside economic measures, for example. So they announced today in a speech towards the French National Assembly that ecological measures would become a priority for the rest of Macron's mandate, but they will need to come up with stronger announcements than just a ban on single plastic use. I mean, that seems obvious that this has to be done. That's a very small step. Much more needs to be done, and I think they need to reshuffle completely the ecological agenda of this presidency. We are still in the policy of small steps that was so heavily criticized by Nicolas Hulot, whom you just mentioned.
Nonetheless, you say it's a small step. It will change people's lives, change consumers' habits, for instance.
It will certainly change consumers' habits, that's for sure. But I would expect the government to announce a reduction in the actual production of plastic in France. The problem is that they announce an increase of the rate of plastics that will be recycled in the future. But what they need to do now is to announce a decrease of the actual amount of plastic to be produced. The problem of recycling, especially the plastic, is that typically plastic is recycled once, at best twice, and then is thrown away. So what we need to do now is to actually reduce the quantity of plastic that is in use, and not only to make it more recyclable.
François Germain, clearly there is a lot of work to be done, but at least it's a start, I suppose.
Yes.
Thank you, sir, very much indeed for joining us and for giving us your analysis. François Germain there of Sciences Po, Earth Politics, and the think tank Ecosphere. We're keeping an eye on that story, of course, for you here, live from Paris. Next, 12 leading members of the Catalan independence movement are awaiting the verdict of their trial in Madrid. They're charged with sedition and face up to 25 years in prison if convicted. The trial comes after the unilateral declaration of independence in Catalonia after the October 2017 referendum, a vote that was turned illegal by Madrid. Well, Sarah Morris is our Madrid correspondent. She joins us now live. Sarah, good evening to you. Tell us what we're expecting from this trial.
Well, after 4 months, the trial wrapped up this evening with the closing statements from those defendants. Those 12 Catalan independence leaders said they were innocent. They hadn't done anything illegal in holding that referendum. There was nothing wrong, they said, with allowing people to vote. And many of them stepped back from that declaration of independence, saying that it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. It was symbolic, that nothing was actually implemented. One of the lawyers even said, remember, we didn't, or the defendants didn't even take down the Spanish flag. They respected the orders from the Spanish government, which, of course, after that declaration of independence, sacked the Catalan government and took over running of the region. Now, that's not what the prosecutor's case was accusing the defendants of. The prosecutor said this was nothing more, nothing less than a coup d'etat. They used all means, illegal means, to substitute one legal state of affairs for another state of affairs, elaborating separate institutions, using the institutions that they had, and using violence, said the public prosecutor. And that violence, said the public prosecutor, was enough to justify the charge of rebellion that for the Oriol Junqueras, the former deputy president of Catalonia, carries a conviction of 25 years if he's convicted.
And Sarah, what's the likely wider effect of this trial likely to be?
We've already seen some protests on the streets of Catalonia. About 25,000 people turned out to say that if they are convicted, if their leaders, those independence leaders, are convicted, they will respond with more street protests. There's a very divided Catalonia after that bid to separate in 2017, despite all the dialogue that has been offered by the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, all the attempts to ease the situation. There is a very entrenched nationalist government now in Catalonia, and it doesn't look as if there's much that can be done. The defendants today, many of them in the court, said that if they were given the choice of doing it again, they would. That will be bad news for the acting Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, because he has said that it's time the nationalists started talking to the 52% of Catalans that don't want to break away from the rest of Spain, learning, as Pedro Sánchez says, to live peacefully together.
And when, Sarah, do we expect the verdicts to fall?
Not before the end of the summer, potentially as late as September and October. That will be a very carefully drawn up sentence and verdict by those judges, and the judges will probably want to have a unanimous verdict if at all possible. They're very well aware that the Catalan nationalists on trial have said that they will be taking this verdict. If it is a conviction, they'll be taking it to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
Sarah Morris, thank you very much indeed. Next here, live from Paris, rubber bullets were fired at protesters near to the government buildings in Hong Kong. The protest over a new law to ease extradition to China continues. The demonstrators say the new law will curtail freedom of expression and endanger people who fled China because of their views. Well, Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, has condemned what she called organised riots, Meanwhile, in Europe, the EU says Hong Kong's rights need to be respected.
Scenes of chaos break out in Hong Kong as police fire tear gas to disperse the crowds. Tens of thousands of protesters had gathered in a peaceful show of defiance against the city's legislature. Many wearing goggles, face masks and black in scenes reminiscent of the Occupy protests of 2014.
At the end of the umbrella movement, didn't we have this slogan saying that we will be back? We are back!
Authorities in Hong Kong have been feeling the heat since Sunday after one of the biggest political demonstrations was held since the territory was handed back to China in 1997. And while debate on the extradition bill has been delayed, protesters say they'll remain out on the streets until it's gone.
Your own children are here. They don't like you. You only listen to the Communist Party. Hong Kong never had such a stupid thing. I'll die here today, okay? You move one step forward, I'll die here.
The proposed extradition bill could see Hong Kong residents, foreign and Chinese nationals facing justice on the mainland. Protesters say that flies in the face of the one country, two systems deal struck during the handover from British rule. The political crisis in the city has united judges, the business community and several foreign governments. It's also increased pressure on Hong Kong's pro-Beijing chief executive Carrie Lam to go.
Japan's Prime Minister has called for Iran to play a constructive role in the Middle East. Shinzo Abe made the call in Tehran. He warned against accidental conflict, given the heightened tensions between Washington and Tehran. Abe met with US President Donald Trump last month ahead of this visit to the Iranians.
At the moment, tension is rising in the Middle East region. There is a possibility of an accidental conflict. A military conflict should be prevented at all costs. Peace and stability in the Middle East will benefit not only this region, but also the whole world. Nobody would like a war to happen, and Japan hopes to be able to make any effort it can and to do its best to reduce tension. This is the goal of my trip.
Shinzo Abe there speaking earlier in Tehran. Short break now. After that, it's our Eye on Africa. Stay with us.